So this evening I'm going to, of course, announce the winner of the Dynamic Range Day Award and also the winners of the competition. It's a fantastic competition we've had this year. Before I do that, I'm going to tell you briefly, talk to you about probably the biggest piece of news in the world of the loudness war, in the world of loudness, maybe this year, who knows. And then I'm going to share with you four foolproof ways that you can make sure that you have great dynamics in your music. So I'm going to share the kind of target levels that I use when I'm mastering with a range of different techniques so that you can implement those right now and know that you are at least aiming for the right place, for the loudness sweet spot in your music. But first of all, I just want to talk about that news event. Now, this is something that I just discovered a couple of weeks ago, and I put a post on my blog about it, and it went viral on Facebook. And last time I counted, over 500,000 people had seen the Facebook post about it alone. We'd had hundreds of thousands of hits on the website over the few days, on my website, over the few days that it got posted. And people were staying, people were reading it. The average time that people were on the page was 3 or 4 minutes. So everybody really was, paying attention to this issue and engaging with it. So the chances are, if you're watching this webcast, you probably know about it as well. So I'm not going to spend too long talking about it, but of course the news is that YouTube have implemented loudness normalization. What that means is that it doesn't matter how loud a song is when you upload it, YouTube will measure that loudness and even it out to a standard reference level. So it's a bit like having your own personal YouTube DJ, making sure that you have a consistent listening level. And the reason that they've done that is because they've recently announced Google Play, which is their subscription music service. And one of the key parts of that service is access to all the music on YouTube without any adverts. And as I've said before, the #1 source of complaints from people listening to audio anywhere, TV, radio, online, portable players, wherever, is when the loudness levels jump up and down and are inconsistent. People find it really annoying to have to keep reaching for the volume control. So that's what this problem solves, and that's obviously to create a better user experience for Google Play subscribers. But it also has this fantastic effect, as far as I'm concerned, which is that it makes loudness on YouTube irrelevant. Some super crushed loudness war casualty is not going to sound any louder than a dynamic master that you or I might make. That's not strictly true. The reference level they've chosen is -13 LUFS. We'll talk more about LUFS in a minute. That's fairly loud, and if your music is more dynamic than that, if it has more than, say, 12 dBs peak to loudness ratio, which again we'll talk about in a minute, YouTube is not going to, it doesn't add any extra processing to the audio, and it's not going to cause clipping or distortion. So in that case, your music wouldn't get turned up quite as much. So there are some questions to be asked. There are some concerns about whether that level should be lower, whether it should be closer to -16, like iTunes Radio, for example. And I know that various people are talking to people at YouTube about that, to talk about this issue, and hopefully they might reduce that level so that people can make their music as dynamic as they like. But the truth is, you can get a great sounding master with 12 dBs of peak to loudness ratio. That's roughly DR12 if you use the TT meter, which I'll show you in a minute. So overall, I see this as a hugely positive move. And of course, iTunes Radio already uses loudness normalization. Spotify already uses loudness normalization. TV uses loudness normalization. FM radio has always normalized loudness by applying extra processing. But this stuff is just a volume control. So it just matches the volume of what's being played. So pretty much anywhere in the world now that you go, you're going to hear music at a consistent loudness level. And that means that as a mixing or a mastering engineer, you can make the music as dynamic as you like and know that it's going to be heard on a level playing field with everything else that's out there. And people have said, well, that doesn't solve anything. The crushed loudness war music is still going to sound crushed. And that's true. But what it changes is that, yeah, in the past, people would ask me as a mastering engineer, they'd say, why does this CD, leap out at me on a CD jukebox in a bar, in a pub, when I'm listening to it? And I would say, well, that's because it's louder. And they would say, well, can you make my music more like that? And you kind of go, yes, but there's compromises. I don't care. We want it to be loud. Now, when people hear their music on YouTube and something stands out, chances are it's not going to be because it was loud before. It's probably because it's more dynamic, because the more punch and life you've got in your sound, the more it's going to pop out at you. You find this yourself. If you go and look at a popular YouTube playlist and just sit there and listening to it, the songs that leap out at you are the ones that are more dynamic. So now when people say, how do I get my music to sound more like that? I can say, well, you need it to be more dynamic. And they're going to say, well, can you make my music sound like that? And I'll say, absolutely, I would be delighted to. That for me is the positive benefit of this as far as the loudness wars are concerned going forward. I think the other thing people have said is, okay, but it's already happened on iTunes Radio. It's already happened on Spotify. That didn't make a difference. Why should YouTube make a difference? I just think YouTube is a big deal. I've told people about iTunes Radio and they've said, what's that? But you tell people about YouTube and they go, really? Everybody knows how important YouTube is in the music industry these days. And they take it really seriously. I think artists and record companies are going to pay attention to this. And then one final point just to make is the difference between another argument that people make is they say, well, FM radio has been doing this since forever. That never stopped anybody wanting their music to be loud. The difference there is that FM radio applies extra processing. So if you play Simon and Garfunkel recorded back in the 60s or 70s next to some modern pop tune, the FM radio will apply extra compression, multiband limiting, all of that stuff, the Auburn Optimod, to bring the quieter track up to make it more consistent with the squashed loudness war. So actually, even if something wasn't a loudness war casualty before it gets broadcast on FM radio, by the time you hear it, the chances are it will be. So everything was getting made to sound like the loudness war. This new system that's being used in all these different places based on systems similar to the R128 EBU specification, it's just a volume control. So people are going to hear those original dynamics and all the musical benefits of those, and they're going to hear the loudness war music for what it is, this kind of squashed mess. I could be wrong. Time will tell. I don't expect it to be quick, but I am very hopeful that this kind of system is going to make all the difference in the long run. So I mentioned a few things there, a few ways of measuring music, and now we get onto the demonstration part where I'll show you how those work so that you can start doing this for your own music. So I'm going to put my glasses on and switch over to so that you can see hopefully what I'm working with. If one of the other guys in the Hangout can just tell me, make sure that you can see my screen, just give me a yes. You'll have to say it. Unmute yourself.
Yes, we see your screen.
Excellent, thank you.
I see two waveforms and a VU meter.
There you go. So this is an album that I mastered for Joe Gilder from homestudiocorner.com. It's a great album. I recommend it. We're not really going to listen that much to the music because a lot of this is going to be technical, but I'm just going to show you the different ways that you can judge the loudness and get it in the sweet spot. So first of all, I'll just show you the traditional way of measuring the loudness of music. That's the peak level that we have in all of our, in Pro Tools, in Cubase, everywhere. It's down here on the left where it says master level in Wavelab. So if I just play a little bit of the audio. So you can see that leaping around. It's peaking at -1 because that is my recommended maximum peak level these days to compensate or to allow for Mastered for iTunes guidelines and R128 guidelines that we'll come to in a minute, and also to help safeguard against extra clipping that might be introduced if your music gets MP3 encoded or encoded for iTunes, for example. The thing about peak level is it's not very useful for measuring loudness. You'll know this yourself if you've ever recorded a snare or tried playing a gunshot, say, or any kind of percussive sound. The peak level goes right up to full scale, but it won't necessarily sound that loud, and that's why we use compression and limiting to control that peak level so that we can bring the average level of the signal up, the loudness level. And a much more useful way of measuring loudness is something called RMS. It stands for root mean squared. You can think of it as the average level of the music. It's not really, but it's a much better guide to getting an idea of the loudness of your music. I'll show you RMS in a moment on the TT meter, but before that I want to show you this plugin here. This is the first way that I'm going to suggest that you could judge the loudness of your music. It's an emulation of a VU meter, it's an old analog style needle meter. It's what I used what I was trained to use when I first started mastering 20 years ago. This is a digital emulation. This is the Klanghelm VUMT. You have to use it just because it's such a cool name. But I think that costs about €10, which is maybe $10, something like that. It's incredibly affordable. Okay, it's not free, but there are actually also some free VU emulations out there. I haven't tried them, but any VU emulator will work, provided you can set the reference level. Because there's a quirk in the graphics of this. There we go. Down here you can see, I hope you can see, there's a number that says -18. That's the digital reference level that corresponds to 0 on the VU meter by default. And that's a really good place to start when you're mixing. If you want to put a VU meter on the master output of your digital audio workstation and just balance the levels so that overall you're hovering around 0 and peaking up to +2 at the most when you're mixing, that's a great way to get good signal gain structure when you're mixing. When we're mastering, we probably want to go louder. And this is dynamic range day. I don't want to tell you guys not to be dynamic, but at the same time, I know that one motivation for a lot of people getting into this issue is to get a great balance between loudness and dynamics. They want their music to be dynamic, but they also want it to be loud enough. So I'm going to suggest to you the maximum level that I think you should master at, where you're unlikely to cause problems with your audio, but you can always go more dynamic if you like. So my suggestion for mastering is you calibrate your meter, your VU meter, to read -10. I don't know whether you can see that over the web stream, but I've just adjusted that number to -10 there. And what you're going to see when I play the music back now is the needles hovering around 0, peaking up to maybe +1, +2. I've enabled the wrong plugin. Let's try again.
Like a siren song, you were calling to me all along. You want to show me what is real.
Move on to a louder bit.
I always believe.
And that's it. It's that simple. If you follow those guidelines, you're going to get great results. There's not time to go into all the details on this, obviously, in this webcast, and there's lots more information about all this stuff on my website. But just briefly, you do need to have a balanced EQ if you're going to use VU meters like this. VU meters are more sensitive to bass than RMS meters or loudness meters. So, for example, if there was too much 60 hertz in that audio there, you would see the needles pegging over to the right, even though actually the music wasn't substantially louder. So you do need a balanced EQ going in, and maybe at the end of the Q&A section, I can paste some links in on Facebook for anybody who's interested. There's a video on my site specifically about how to how to get a balanced EQ and the benefits of that for achieving a loud sound. And if I just go off on a quick tangent, actually, there's another video I did recently where I was looking at Skrillex, showing that even EDM sounds better with more dynamics. Some people came back and commented that it still didn't sound as good to them, the more dynamic version, on mobile devices. I used a Match EQ plugin, got it to sound much more similar because there were differences between the two versions of the songs that I was comparing. And for me, it was indistinguishable on mobile devices, even though we still had all the dynamics. So actually, EQ can sometimes be more important than, quotes, loudness in terms of getting your music to translate and work on the widest possible range of systems. Let's move on to method number 2 of judging loudness, and that is the TT meter here. You probably already know about the TT meter. If you don't, there is a post on my website. In fact, I'll just Google for it. It's not completely free. In order to get it, you have to sign up as a, quotes, active member of the Pleasurized Music Foundation. All the links are in this post on my website. It's not expensive. It costs maybe, I think, $30 to sign up, and then you get to download the meter and use it yourself. It's still my favorite meter of this kind. The people who developed it, Brainworks, released an update called the BX meter. I don't like it as much. They changed the way that the ballistics of the meter worked. I'm not convinced it was as successful. The great thing about the TT meter, I will just enable it and play a bit of the music so that you can see. You will see the peak level leaping right up to the top. Still has a peak meter. You'll see the RMS level, which is the kind of thicker green bars on the left and right, and in the middle of the meter over here on the right, you will see a kind of a block squashing and expanding, and that represents the difference between the peak and the RMS level of the music. Sometimes people call it the crest factor, and it's a great indication of how squashed, how compressed, or how limited your music is. I'll play a bit so you can see it. So you could see that bar in the center was kind of orange most of the time, which means it's kind of hovering around between a reading of 8 and 9. Sometimes it went red. I'm happy to just kind of allow it to push into the red a little bit when I'm mastering. And as I say, what that's giving you is the difference between the RMS level, which is a good indicator of loudness, and the peak level. So the peak level is going to be right up close to 0 when we're mastering these days. Not when you're mixing. Peaks could be, I don't know, -6, -10, doesn't really matter. But when you come to master, you will be lifting the level up probably. And so if it's peaking at -1 and the RMS is at -9, the difference between those two is 8 dBs. And that corresponds, that's called the DR8 on the TT meter. DR stands for dynamic range. It's not really measuring dynamic range, but I didn't name the meter, so don't shoot me. It's really measuring something that's closer to the crest factor. And it's the difference between the peak and the loudness of the music. And if you keep that 8 or more all the time, even at the loudest moments of your music, then you're going to be right at the top end of what I call the sweet spot. You don't want your music to be too dynamic. If you take it into a noisy environment, people won't be able to hear the verses and the choruses will sound too loud. You need some dynamic control. You need some dynamic management. That's part of one of the skills of mixing and mastering. And dynamic range day is not about not using compression, not using limiters, and not controlling the dynamics of your music. It's about finding the sweet spot and not going too far. In my experience, if you start pushing so that the TT meter reads DR7 or less consistently, that's when you start to have problems with the music. That's when you start to lose punch, clarity, impact, all of those things that we want to keep. So that's method number 2. Method number 3 uses one of the new types of loudness meters. Now I'm going to use the Meter Plugs Lcast meter. TC Electronic make a meter, which is one of the prizes in the competition. New Gen Audio make a meter, which is one of the prizes in the competition this year. And there are also some very affordable implementations that you can use as well if you want to play around with them. And lots of DAWs now have this stuff built in. I'm hearing something. What does that noise mean? Oh, I'm gonna. Can you guys still hear and see me? Can you just give me somebody say yes or no who's in the Hangout?
Yep.
Yeah, all good?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption.
All good.
Where was I? Loudness meters. There are some more affordable versions, yes, and some DAWs include them. You can see there's a loudness meter up here in Wavelab. I think Cubase, the latest version, has a loudness meter built in. The latest version of Pro Tools has loudness metering built in, so you may already have access to these meters yourself. Roughly speaking, one of these loudness... Okay, so the standard used to measure loudness was developed in order to implement a law in America to regulate the loudness of adverts. Viewers got so ticked off with the way that the adverts would come blasting out at them at much higher loudness than the programming. They got so many complaints that the government decided to regulate it. At the same time, in Europe, in the EBU, a group called PLoud were developing a standard called R128. And all of these people came together and eventually agreed an international standard method of measuring loudness. It's measured in loudness units, LU, and you'll often hear people talk about LUFS, which stands for loudness unit full scale. You also get LKFS. The units are the same thing, it's just a different name for the units. And they're really easy to use because one LU is roughly equivalent to a dB. In fact, it's exactly equivalent to a dB. So if you turn your song up by 1 dB with no other processing, you would expect to see the loudness unit reading go up by a dB. And there are standards that have been implemented for radio and TV broadcast that use this standard. The advantage for us is that the development of these standards is open source, so everybody is at liberty to develop a loudness meter, and that means we've got these great new tools. Now, the interesting thing is, if the EQ of your song is balanced, as I mentioned back when we were using the VU meter, you will find that the VU reading, given the calibration, and the RMS reading and the loudness reading are all going to be very similar. So lots of people kind of email me and say, what is this LUFS, how do I read it? If you think of it as being pretty much like RMS, except it takes into account the sensitivity of our ear to bass and treble. As we turn sounds up, we hear more bass and treble. It's one of the things that drove the loudness war in the first place. And these new loudness meters take that into account. So if you pile a load of mid-range into your signal, chances are the loudness meter will read it as being louder because it recognizes that that's a sensitive part of our ear. If you add more bass, probably the loudness reading won't go up as much. So let's see what this meter gives us if I measure this song.
To me all along, you want to show me what is real. It's better this way. It's better today than it's ever been.
So I've got two readings being displayed on the meter here. You can see there's a pale blue one and there's a green one. The green one is the short-term loudness. There are 3 or possibly 4 types of loudness measurement in this new standard. There's the momentary loudness, which basically will look like the peak meter jumping up and down. There's the short-term loudness, which will give you something closer to what a VU meter or an RMS meter would display. And there's the integrated loudness, which is the overall loudness of whatever you've just been listening to. And that's what the pale blue line is on this graph. In fact, if I just disable quickly the short-term loudness to show you, that's the integrated loudness. You can see it doesn't change that much, and it's gradually creeping up because the song started just before the chorus and then it hit the chorus and the loudness went up a little bit. If I re-enable the short-term and turn off the integrated loudness, you can see the way that the short-term loudness is varying. So there you can kind of see how the music varies. And if you're looking for a loudness meter, I really recommend you find one that has this kind of graph. The Meter Plugs version is really nice because you can actually expand and contract the scale of the meter. So I can shrink this down, I can expand it up, I can zoom in and get more detail if I like. But providing you have some kind of graph, you're going to be in good shape. It gives you a really nice snapshot of the shape of the loudness within your song, as well as the overall loudness. And if you look here, you can see that the maximum loudness there was -9 LUFS. I swear I didn't set that up. This is the raw session as I mastered it, which fits in with my recommendations, right? Because I was saying RMS about -9 with the peak about -1 gives you 8 dBs difference. That's DR8 on the TT meter. If you think about the VU meter here, we've got it calibrated to -10. So the average level is around about -10. It was peaking up to +1, which is -9, which fits in. And the integrated loudness here is reading as -11.7, -12. You need to be careful with the integrated loudness if you're trying to use it to judge the loudness of your music, because it averages the whole thing. If you imagine, let's imagine a metal album where it's basically full tilt for the whole song. And if you're following my guidelines, you've got that peaking up about -9 RMS or -9 LUFS. That's going to give you a pretty high integrated loudness because the song was loud all the way through the song. If you then imagine that same song, but it has a really quiet acoustic guitar introduction, you're going to get a lower loudness level during that introduction, and that's going to pull the integrated loudness, the overall loudness value, down. So people keep asking me for guideline LUFS levels to master their music at, and I'm uncomfortable with giving those because it depends on the material. But the guideline I can give you is don't push it higher than -9 LUFS at the loudest points when it's peaking at -1. And pretty much in any genre, you're going to be in good shape. So if it's a metal album, it might be up at that kind of loudness for most of the time. And if it's progressive rock, where the song builds up and it has, you know, keyboard solo in the middle or something and the level drops down, or it's folk, maybe, you know, acoustic or singer-songwriter stuff, you might get a lot more variation. But if you keep your eye on the maximum, because what you're looking for is not squashing that peak to loudness ratio. So now I've talked about the kind of the crest factor, the peak to RMS level in terms of the TT meter. With these new meters, we still have a peak measurement, but we also have the loudness measurement. So we can talk to peak to loudness ratio. And a peak to loudness ratio of 8 dBs is roughly equivalent to a TT DR reading of 8. So they're just different ways of measuring the same stuff. So the final way, I promised you 4 foolproof ways to judge this stuff. I'll just briefly mention that my perception plugin also gives you an indication. In fact, it gives you a readout of the property that I just mentioned, the peak to loudness ratio. Here's perception on the right, and you can see we have a pre and a post peak to loudness ratio. So if I just play a bit of the music here.
Oh, you were calling to me all along. You want to show me what is real. It's better this way. It's better today than it's ever been.
if you're watching the numbers over there, you could see that the pre-peak to loudness ratio was roughly 12. That's kind of equivalent to a TT-DR reading, DR12. And the post is 9.4. Now, what Perception is doing is it's measuring the loudness before the mastering processing that I've got on the song. I've got there's a level lift there, I've got an EQ, and then I've got some TC electronics processing here to get the sonic results that I want. So it's measuring the loudness before all of that processing, and then it's measuring the loudness, the mastered loudness afterwards, and it's telling me the peak to loudness ratio of both of them. So that's giving you, again, similar information to the TT meter. We don't have the nice squashy bar in the middle yet, but if that's something you're interested in, keep an eye on my website and Twitter stream and Facebook in the upcoming months. But it does give you those numbers, and again, keep this at 8 or 9 and you're going to be in great shape. And just briefly, the other advantages of using Perception over any of these other methods is that you get the instant bypass of the mastering effects chain. Of course, that's confusing because the mastered version is louder. So you can use the balance control to even out that before and after loudness.
It's better this way. It's better today than it's ever been before.
And there you've got a loudness matched before and after comparison, bypassing this entire mastering processing chain with one click. And I'll play that to you one more time and just show you, because you can see the values on the TT meter changing. You could do this yourself, of course. I'm showing you Perception, but you could use a loudness meter to measure the loudness of your signal before you master it, and then use another instance of the loudness meter to measure the loudness afterwards, and then adjust the post gain so that the two match, and then you could do the bypass yourself. And if you do that, you'll see similar results on the TT meter that we're seeing on Perception. Perception is showing that value of 12 before and 9 afterwards.
All along, you want to show me what is real.
TT meter there was reading 10. If I hit bypass,
Better this way. It's better today.
those values were up closer to 12, which is the pre-value the Perception is reading. So there you go. Those are the 4 foolproof. They're not entirely foolproof because you need that balanced EQ, and of course you need to achieve the level boost that you're going for in an effective, good sounding way. If you just ram everything through a limiter, you might get the loudness where you want it, but it might not sound great. But that's beyond the scope of what I can show you in this Hangout. So now I'm going to switch off the screen sharing so I can talk to you again. That seems to have worked. So at the end of this Hangout, I will do a Q&A, and if you have any questions about that, I'd be glad to answer them. One thing to say is that if you found that useful and interesting, but you want more information, do go to my site, productionadvice.co.uk. There's a mass of stuff there. If you go to the main site, there's a button that says, I forget what my own button is labeled with. Let me check. There you go. Mastering what and how. If you click that button, there's a page there specifically with a whole mass of free resources that are going to go into loads more detail for you about how to achieve great results mastering your own music, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. So now we get to the announcements. First of all, the Dynamic Range Day Award. I think what I'll do is show you the web page for that, so that I want to tell you the shortlist, and also some of the honourable mentions, because people keep asking me whether I think things are getting better. Is Dynamic Range Day having an effect? And I think my reply to them is that things are getting more polarised. The worst examples are probably sounding worse than they ever have. They're louder and with more undesirable side effects. But the best examples really are starting to sound great. And if we look at this shortlist here, something I'm really pleased about is the commercial success of some of those examples. So Mark Ronson's Uptown Special, I mean, Uptown Funk is looking to be maybe the biggest selling single of 2015. It measures DR8 on the TT meter. That's a great dynamic song. People love it. Pharrell's Happy, Daft Punk's Get Lucky, Blurred Lines, all of these songs have been huge hits, even though they've had really great, very good dynamics by modern standards. Maybe not if you're a fan of what happened prior to the Loudness Wars. But as I say, an overall reading of DR8 on a song, if it's done well, can sound great. And there are other examples as well. People often say, oh, R&B has to be crushed, has to be clipping and, to sound right. But Black Messiah by D'Angelo measures DR8 on the TT meter. Sounds fantastic. J. Cole, 2014 Forest Hills Drive, that album, I mean, there's an interview with him on NPR where he specifically talks about the fact that he and his engineer wanted to not compete with the Loudness Wars. They wanted to have dynamics in their music. They wanted to have that sound. And the fantastic thing is that the fans have responded to that. His engineer Mez has retweeted a bunch of messages from people saying how great they think it sounds, and nobody complaining that it's not loud enough. Aphex Twin's last album, straight up electronica, plenty of dynamic range, measures DR8. Jack White's Lazaretto album measures DR10. His previous album, Blunderbuss, won a previous Dynamic Range Day Award and measured DR11. That's even though White Stripes, his previous band, routinely released stuff that was really heavily crushed and loaded with distortion. He's seen the light. He's releasing stuff with dynamics. He's still topping the Billboard charts, still selling huge numbers of records. People love it. He's releasing his stuff on vinyl. People like it even more. That's a whole other story. We won't go there. Metal albums. Earlier on today, I shared on the Facebook page some stuff from, I think it's metalfied.com, reviewing. I mean, metal fans probably care about loudness and sound quality more than some genres, Some people see that as ironic because it's a really loud music. It's intended to be really loud. It's full of distorted guitars and sometimes screaming vocals and all the rest of it. But it sounds better with more dynamics, just like everything else. In the shortlist we have Pale Communion by Opeth, but there's also a much more aggressive album by Horrendous called, I think, Ectasis. I don't know whether I pronounced that right, which also sounds great and is full of dynamics. That measures DR10. The last U2 album, Songs of Innocence, I don't think it's their best sounding record ever, but it measures DR9, and that's after How to Build an Atomic Bomb measured, I think, DR5 or DR6 something, and that was really aggressively crushed. They've moved back from this Loudness War sound. So head over to dynamicrangeday.co.uk/award and take a look at yourself for some of the examples there. There's a Spotify playlist with some examples. I'm really pleased that we've got such a great shortlist to choose from this year. Enough talk. The winner this year is Stephen Wilson for Hand Cannot Erase. It's a fantastic album. I posted on Twitter. I'm kind of addicted to it. I find it hard to listen to anything else. It measures DR11, I think. Yep, DR11. It sounds amazing. So did his previous album. So does everything he works on. To some extent, we're giving this award to him this year simply because it would be inconceivably rude not to. He's been nominated at least 2 or 3 years previously. Everything he works on has great dynamics. Everything he works on sounds fantastic. And I know that he's an incredibly popular choice with the community, the Dynamic Range Day community. So I'm delighted to finally award Stephen Wilson a Dynamic Range Day award. But do check out some of those other artists that are on the website there for yourself. And please share them. I mean, I know I'm talking to you guys. You're watching this broadcast. You know all this stuff. You care about this stuff. Use these examples as evidence for your clients, for your friends, to reassure yourself if you get nervous about putting more dynamics into your own release. If all of these artists can have the success that they've had with great dynamics in their music, so can anybody. So can you. So now we get to the competition. There were almost 20,000 entries in the competition this year. Over 4,000 of you are hoping to win one of these prizes, and I can understand why, because they were a great set of prizes. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to take a bit of time and talk about each of those prizes because I'm so pleased to have the support from the sponsors that we do. It's one of the things that helps Dynamic Range Day be the success that it is. So I'm going to announce them in reverse order. First of all, we have 3 copies of the EQ Strategies Platinum Bundle from Audio Issues. AudioIssues.com is another great site for people who are making their own music, trying to figure out how to get a good mix, how to get great recordings, especially in a home studio environment if you haven't got major bucks to throw around. And the EQ Strategies Bundle has been recently re-released. Björgvin has put in a whole load of new content in there, new videos, I think, and extra materials that make that a fantastic package. And the 3 winners of that are, apologies for mispronouncing anybody's names, Juicy Craft, I think that is, Simon van der Becken, and David Langston. I know a David Langston. If it's the David Langston that I know, congratulations, I'm delighted that you've won a prize. This was all done by computer. There is no cheating. If you're not the David Langston that I know, well, congratulations anyway. The next 2 prizes are 3-month subscriptions to duelingmixes.com. Dueling Mixes is a membership site set up by Joe Gilder and Graham Cochran from the Recording Revolution. Joe runs Home Studio Corner, and it was his album that I was using as an example in the demonstration just now. Dueling Mixes is such a great idea. I wish I'd had an idea for this site. Every month, Joe and Graham both mix the same song without conferring, and then they post a video showing how they did it, showing all the tips, tricks, the problems that they came, how they overcame them, their thoughts about what they achieved, where they did it. And every month the members of the site get to watch those videos. They get the raw files to mix the songs for themselves, and they get to vote on which mix they liked the most. So it's such a great idea. It's such a great site. I know people get an immense amount of value out of it. And the 2 winners of the 3-month subscriptions are Jack Elmy and Barbara Ohlenforst. So congratulations to you. Now, late on in the competition this year, I got an email from Cambridge Audio who wanted to donate some prizes to the competition, and they asked to donate 10 of their DAC Magic XS USB headphone adapters. So it's a tiny little unit. You plug it into the USB output of your computer, your laptop, whatever, and you get a really high quality headphone feed for your headphones. Each one is worth £100. It's a fantastic prize. Rather than distribute a whole other 10 prizes and a whole other 10 names, I thought what I would do is I would give one of these to everybody who wins a prize from now on. So the next 10 prize winners, right up to the first prize, will get the prize I'm going to announce and the Cambridge Audio DAC Magic XS USB headphone adapter. And the first prize to announce is to get 3 of your songs mastered by me. Unfortunately, I can't offer an attended session as part of this prize, but I can do a remote mastering session for you. I hope the person who wins is actually making their own music and can make use of the session. Maybe if not, they can give it to a friend. The winner of this prize is Hunter Christie. Congratulations. I'll look forward to hearing your music. All the prize winners are going to be informed by email. I will also put the names on the website in due course. Next up, we have a pair of NAD Viso HP50 headphones. These are very well reviewed headphones. I haven't tried them myself, but as you'll know if you've watched my home recording studio videos where I show you how I set up this room. This isn't a full mastering studio. This is a room, it used to be my garage. It's where I do a lot of my work from. It's where I do a lot of my listening. It's where I make all my videos and write blog posts. And my monitoring is being run from an old NAD amplifier. It's a classic. They still make fantastic gear. I highly recommend NAD products, and I haven't heard these headphones, but I'm sure they sound great. What Hi-Fi magazine reviewed them very well. The winner of the NAD Viso HP50 headphones is Amord Ramirosoa. I'm sure that's not how that's pronounced. I do apologize for mangling your name. Maybe I should have rehearsed these beforehand. Congratulations, we'll be emailing you soon. Next up, FabFilter Pro L mastering limiter. So many people in the home mastering masterclass course that I run have moved over to using FabFilter plugins and love them. They make a multiband compressor. They make the Pro Q EQ, which I have tried myself and I really like. They're great looking plugins. They're great sounding plugins. They're really well thought out. I really like them. And the Pro L mastering limiter is no exception. The winner of the Pro L mastering limiter, as well as the Cambridge Audio DAC Magic converter, is Christian Theray. Congratulations, Christian. Next, 3 copies of my Perception plugin that you saw me use briefly in the demonstration there. The goal of Perception is to help you find the loudness sweet spot for your music. That doesn't mean it makes stuff loud. It means you hear how the processing that you're using changes the audio clearly without being deceived by the loudness. It bypasses the loudness deception. I'm very proud of it. We've had a great response. It's won some awards. I think you'll like it. And the 3 winners of Perception and the DAC Magic Cambridge Audio Converter are Scott McCollum, Michael Perkins, and Dennis Lafollette. Congratulations, guys. I hope you enjoy using Perception. Next up, we have the TC Electronic Stereo Loudness Package. TC Electronic, I say this every year, they've been supporters of Dynamic Range Day from the outset. They're working on that EBU P-Loud group that I mentioned, developing the loudness standards that are now being used to hopefully help end this insane loudness war. They've done a lot of the research into intersample clipping and all the rest of it, and they make great sounding audio gear. I have a TC PowerCore 6000 here. You saw the plugins briefly when I was using them in the demo earlier. In fact, I also have Bowers & Wilkins speakers in here. I'm so proud of the fact that so many of the sponsors of Dynamic Range Day are companies whose gear I use and love. I'm very pleased that there's such a close alignment between this cause that I care about and the people who are supporting it. It feels really good. So the TC Electronic Loudness Package includes a loudness meter, I believe a plugin that will adjust loudness to the required level for situations where you need control over loudness. I can't say that TC, I think they were the first with these products to market, and I think they're still some of the best. So this is a fantastic prize. And the winner of the TC Electronic Stereo Loudness Pack is Miles Doyle. Congratulations, Miles. Now we have another prize from Loudness specialists. This time it's New Gen Audio. They also make a Loudness bundle similar to the one that to the TC bundle, but the prize that they have donated to the competition is their Master Pack bundle, which includes a mastering limiter, a loudness meter. There's 4 or 5 plugins in the package. One in particular that I like very much, I'm going to do a YouTube video on soon, now that Dynamic Range Day is out of the way, is their Visualizer plugin. It's a suite of analyzation tools, and it has what for me is a unique and probably a killer application. I really like it, so watch out for a video where I describe that. The winner of the New Gen Audio Master Pack plugin suite and the Cambridge Audio DAC Magic USB headphone converter is Malcolm Kemp. Congratulations, Malcolm. I mentioned Bowens and Wilkin briefly. B&W. When I worked as a mastering engineer at SRT for 15 years, I sat in front of a pair of B&W Matrix 801 speakers for 8 to 12 hours a day. I love those speakers. One day I will have a room of my own big enough where I can have a set. For the time being, in my home mastering studio, I'm using some 602 hi-fi speakers that I got as a 30th birthday present. I've been listening to them ever since. They sound incredible given the price and the fact that they're not that big. And the closest equivalent that you can get these days is the Bowers & Wilkins 685 speaker. It's moved on, I'm sure, over the years. The technology has improved. It sounds even better. I haven't auditioned the 685s myself, but they're, again, very highly reviewed in What Hi-Fi magazine. They were the stereo speaker in that price range of the year, last year. And I'm delighted that that's what the second prize in the competition this year is. And the winner of the Bowers & Wilkins 685 speakers is Zachary Alexander. I don't know whether that's a first name, last name reversal. So it might be Alexander Zachary. Congratulations, whichever way around it is. And finally, we come to the first prize. It's the big one. It's worth £2,799. That's in excess of $4,000. It's been donated by SSL, Solid State Logic. I say this every year. They were the first company to come forward. They suggested the idea of the competition for Dynamic Range Day back in 2011. And it was that suggestion and the arrival of the competition that really kick-started the event and started this progress that we had. I did an interview for CE Pro magazine. I linked to it on the website, on the Facebook page earlier today. And Bob asked me how had Dynamic Range Day developed over the years. And I said, it's really hard to judge because, you know, it's difficult to measure. It's hard to know what all these numbers mean. But that first year, there were maybe a few hundred of us on Twitter, I don't think, maybe on Facebook, trying to make some noise about the Loudness Wars. Now we have over 11,000 likes on the Facebook page this year, thousands more on Twitter. That post that went viral reached 500,000 people. So there's no question that this event is growing. And I put down a lot of that to SSL's generosity over the years. This year, the prize is a Sigma analog summing unit. It's remote controlled. I believe you control it on an iPad or another remote device. So you put it in your rack and you can use it to get that SSL analog sound on your mixes. That's another hot debate out there. I'm not going to get into that now, but I know there are people who really want that for themselves, and coming from a company with the pedigree of SSL, I'm sure this is a fantastic piece of kit. So without further ado, the winner of the first prize in the Dynamic Range Day 2015 competition is John Baum, or Baum. Congratulations, John. As I say, all of the winners will be informed by email, and I will connect you with the companies who provided your prize, and they will arrange to send those prizes directly to you. Thank you so much to everybody who entered. Congratulations if you won. If you didn't win, commiserations, but I'm sure we'll be back next year. Please try again then. And do keep an eye on my website, because I'm running more promotional kind of giveaways and competitions now as time goes on. So every so often there's something cool to be won. You never know when you might get lucky. So that's the end of the structured part of the webcast. Thank you so much for taking part in Dynamic Range Day. Thank you so much for being here, for watching this webcast, taking part in the competition, for all your tweets and Facebook status updates and sharing the stuff that we've been putting out. Thanks for your support. It's great to connect with you. It's getting to the point now where people, I don't know how I would ever give this event up if I wanted to, because people 3 months in advance are emailing me saying, when is it happening? What's going to happen? How's it going to work? You know, it's great to have that support and that enthusiasm from you guys. So thank you. And if you need to rush off, you've seen the best bits now. But we will go to do some Q&A, I think. I'm going to have a sip of whiskey. Jura Origin, that is, since people always ask me. Very nice too. I'll put my glasses on. And let's see if I can get up some of the questions. I'm going to head over to the Facebook page. So if you haven't already posted your question, now is an ideal time. Facebook.com/dynamic range.
I saw a few comments, Ian, about limiting the individual tracks, and people were wanting you to speak about that.
Really? Okay. For me personally, I don't tend to use limiters in mixing at all. Certainly not digital brick wall limiters like, you know, mastering limiters. And I don't use a mastering limiter on the output bus either. If you're talking about, say, an 1176 or some kind of, you know, analog emulation, or a Fairchild, you know, which has those kind of old pieces of gear have modes where what they do is very close to limiting. Obviously, in that case, if you're using that on an individual track and you're doing that for the color or the sound, absolutely, you know, go for it. But for me personally, I prefer not to. I mean, I guess you could use a limiter as a kind of a safety mechanism if you're driving an analog output chain, or if you have plugins that have emulation of analog saturation characteristics, that kind of thing. You might choose not to. You might not want to push those too hot in terms of the peak level. So in that case, maybe using a limiter gently would be a good idea. But yeah, I'm very restrained with limiters in general. I mean, if I showed you the limiter that I was using on that song in the demonstration there, you had 2 or 3 dBs limiting maximum on that. In mastering, I prefer to have a compressor followed by a limiter. So the compressor does quite a bit of the heavy lifting with slow attack times typically, and then the limiter can just catch those peaks and prevent clipping distortion. And incidentally, I said in the demonstration that I was kind of telling you my either, you know, if it's a limiter where you drag down the threshold and the gain goes up, then just ease that threshold up. If you're boosting the gain somewhere earlier in the chain and pushing it harder into the limiter, just take the final stage before the limiter back 2 or 3 dBs. You'll get back some of that peak headroom without a dramatic change to the sound of the audio. You can get, you know, so many people will say, oh, I need the limiting or whatever it is, the clipping, to get the sound of the genre. And I haven't yet found, you know, I've found examples in R&B, in EDM, in metal, in pop, in rock, pretty much any genre you can think of, you can get the sound that you want without using heavy limiting. So did any of the questions say why they wanted to use limiting specifically, Matt, or?
I didn't know. Basically, it was, the idea was people are crushing the individual tracks and then crushing the master fader, so squashing the life out of it. And one of the comments was limit until the explosiveness of the song starts going away and then back off. But they were just little comments asking about that, like where it was left open.
See, here's an interesting thing is that the way that I was taught, somebody literally said to me within a week of arriving in the building at the mastering facility where I worked, peak level doesn't matter. Peak level is irrelevant. It tells us nothing about loudness. It's just tracing the waveform. You know, it's not really telling you a real, I mean, it'll tell you when clipping distortion happens, so it's important in that sense, but the solution to that is to use a limiter. So when I first started mastering, I was just using EQ and limiting, and that was possible because the average levels back then were much lower. You know, everything was DR12 or DR14, so you didn't need any extra compression. So for me, I'm kind of not interested in what the limiter is doing. People agonize about which limiter to use, what settings to use, all the rest of it. I have some that I like to use. I put it in, and if I don't hear anything that's concerning me, I probably don't look at it during the mastering session, because it's just there taking off these peaks. And if it's doing its job right, the effect of the limiter should be invisible. You shouldn't even know that it's there. At the point where you start to hear a limiter, that's when you've got a problem. And so I would agree with the comment you just said in that sense, that the Okay, that said, I had a server error. I'm not sure whether I'm still live or not. I'm just going to go over.
Well, I can hear you at least.
Yeah.
So you guys are still there. One of you has your speakers on because I can hear myself bouncing back. So somebody who's been watching on Twitter, can you @ Dynamic Range Day and let us know whether you're still able to hear what's going on, please, or post a comment in the Facebook. I'm glad it lasted to the end of the hangout proper anyway, or the end of the prizes.
You're still live.
We're still live?
Yes.
Excellent.
I'm looking at you on YouTube now.
Okay, good. In that case, I'll carry on. So what was I talking about? Limiting.
Limiting.
Go on. Remind me.
You were told that limiting just takes off the peaks. It's irrelevant to loudness, and you were using EQ and limiting only when you first started. The levels were lower. And
Thanks.
You were wrong about that.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is that the problem with limiters is that they're designed to control peaks. And if that's all that they do, they're going to work fine. If you think about a drum transient that kind of up like that, and if it just restricts that initial transient a little bit, you can do that with virtually no audible effect on the sound. But if you then think of a vocal waveform where you've got a much smoother waveform, if that, or say a bass guitar, because typically bass is something that suffers a lot from limiting, if those waveforms that have a lot less peak information start getting controlled by a limiter, you know, the action of a limiter is fast. It's kind of clamp down on the signal to control it. If you start doing that on a signal that's supposed to be a sine wave, you're going to be adding all these kind of jagged distortions into the waveform, and that's how it sounds. If you take a pure kind of simple bass sound and push it up into a limiter, it will start to distort. That might be a cool effect that you want musically, depending on what genre you're in. But in mastering, my goal is always to be invisible. I want the music to sound better and for people to not really know why. I don't want them to go, oh, listen to that compressor, or listen to the limiting on that, or that's a cool EQ. It's kind of like music in a film. If you notice the music in a film, it's failed. if you notice the processing in mastering, it's failed. And that's not always true, but that's a great place to start from, I think. So yeah, when you use a limiter so hard that it starts cutting into the body of the signal, that's when it's going to start really damaging things. So I do kind of agree with that original comment of saying, you know, push it up until it starts to take something away from the track and then back off a little bit. But I would be inclined to say, you know, don't think about the limiter so much. The limiter is there to control the peaks. Think about the EQ. Think about the compression. I mean, if you follow the guidelines for the levels that I've given you earlier on in the webcast, you're unlikely ever to push the music so hard that you're getting more than 3 or 4 dBs of limiting. And if you are, maybe you need to be thinking about using a bit more compression earlier in the process, or a bit more, or changing the EQ and figuring something else out. So, yeah, I think overusing limiting. I guess it's in some ways it's a miscommunication. People know that mastering engineers often only use EQ and limiting, and then they try and do that with their own music. But it's only going to work if you're fairly conservative with the levels, and if you've got a balanced EQ, and if you've got good dynamic control going into it. If you just take a track with very little compression and push it up into a limiter, that's almost guaranteed to sound bad. Yeah, so that's probably enough on that question. What else do we have?
And someone else is asking about classical music. How is this going to affect classical music since it's so dynamic?
I guess they're asking about YouTube.
Yes.
That's one of the objections that I and Bob Katz and other mastering engineers I'm talking to have with the level they've chosen. I mean, I guess you could argue that classical music maybe isn't subject to the loudness wars, excuse me, in the same way. So there's kind of two areas of classical music right now. There's classical music, which tends to have a very purist, hands-off recording and post-production ethos. And then there's your kind of, I mean, here in the UK we have a radio station called Classic FM, which it has adverts, it has DJs, you know, and it's big and it's loud, and it's playing the kind of the pop side of the classical. Quite often there's electronic music instruments in the mix, and you know, maybe it's film soundtrack stuff, and it's much more, it's quite poppy despite maybe being classical music originally. That stuff is going to work fine going onto YouTube because it's probably pretty squashed, just like everything else these days. Whereas a Stravinsky symphony or Mahler or, you know, a string quartet or something probably won't, but probably the people who are watching that are going to be less concerned about it as an issue. It's probably not as important to them or to the people who are making those recordings that it plays back at a similar loudness to everything. So I guess in that sense, it's no better or no worse. The reservation about the level that YouTube have chosen is just that some people are going to feel they ought to push their music further than they would ideally choose to in order to not have it lower than everything else. And the great thing about loudness normalization is that if it can free everybody from that, you know, you can just make your music sound the way you want it to. You can make it sound great. And the -16 level that iTunes have settled on, I think, is a good compromise. Broadcast, it's -23. But that has to allow for feature film soundtracks, which have a very dynamic range. You know, you've got stuff like explosions and all kinds of effects in them, so you need even more headroom in that situation. I think somewhere around that -16 is a much better figure. So hopefully we can persuade YouTube to. I mean, the great thing is that it's a playback-only setting. They're not processing the audio. So if we can persuade them that level should be lower, they just type a different number into a box, and we all get a different normalization level. So I don't see it as a kind of particularly, it's not a drastically urgent thing at this stage. You know, I think it's better to celebrate that YouTube have done something great, because the most important thing is it removes the incentive to just crush things ridiculously. You know, there's no point anymore in doing a DR4, DR3 master, because it'll only make your music sound worse pretty much everywhere. So that's the really positive bit, I think. Speech is another one. Speech is another audio signal is naturally very dynamic. If you're not using compression and limiting, I think there's a good chance that a lot of, like my podcasts where I'm talking to you, something like this, it'll be interesting to see what kind of loudness level this comes out at when it's uploaded to YouTube at the end of the Hangout. So yeah, there are concerns about the level, but I don't think it's a disaster at this point. I'm seeing here in the chat, Diego saying, someone is asking if Beatport would be the next ones in for loudness normalization. Beatport would be great. I mean, it's not everywhere yet. I think we've covered the big ones, which is iTunes Radio, Spotify, and YouTube. But SoundCloud is another one that lots of people have mentioned where there is no loudness normalization. And I mean, yes, I hope that all of these places will implement that. And one nice thing about the blog post last week about YouTube is that I've had people coming back to me and saying, well, this is great. What about SoundCloud? So I say to them, ask them about it. I tweeted SoundCloud about it. They say they're looking into it. So hopefully all of these different places will ultimately implement something along these lines. So yeah, to remove that incentive to go stupid loud anywhere. I'm going to head over to speak up, any of you guys. If Siegadora asks if Pandora have any loudness control. I don't know. If anybody knows, please send me something via Twitter, maybe.
You know what, Ian? The thing that actually made me stop and really take a look at the loudness, with all of our discussions, one of you guys said that loudness, you related loudness to emotion, and talked about classical music. And so then people started posting as examples to me, posting in Pensado students songs like classical music, and saying, "Hey, Ma, no, look at the loudness here, because I like classical music. It affects me in ways that other music does not." And when I took a look at what was actually going on volume-wise, dynamic, like the dynamics of the volume, it never even occurred to me that an emotional tool was being taken away. And that's what got me. It's an emotional tool.
It absolutely is. I mean, music has... I've been thinking about a blog post about this for a while, and I haven't written it yet. How many dimensions does it have? You have pitch, you have time, you have timbre, and you have loudness. You have dynamics. So in that sense, music is four-dimensional. Maybe I've missed one, but so if you use auto-tune, you're removing some of the pitch possibilities for emotion. If you're using synth presets, you remove a lot of the timbral possibilities of live instruments. If you remove loudness, I mean, how many dimensions of music are we going to cut out? And I totally agree. I mean, if you go to productionadvice.co.uk/YouTube-loudness, I think that's the URL, or just go to the front page and look. It's the post is on the front page. I embedded in that original post a YouTube playlist. It's not my playlist. It's just top songs from the last few weeks or months. If you just stick that on, press play, and leave it in the background, do something else, and wait until something catches your attention, I bet it's Uptown Funk or Happy or one of these dynamic songs that's in there. And what I find with those, it's not so much emotion, but I start nodding my head and tapping my foot. And dance music, pop music is all about the beat. It's all about the contrast between the drum being there and not being there. And a great drummer, it's all about the subtle differences between different snare hits and all of that stuff. That's all loudness. The more you take away that stuff, the less people are going to want to dance. And in terms of when you get to the chorus, you want it to lift and to the great thing about classical music, about orchestral music, is when it gets to a crescendo, when it gets to the really loud bits, you're kind of like pinned to your chair by the sound of it. And that's what I want from my pop music. I went to see Goldfrapp in Cambridge a couple of years ago. The live sound was fantastic. It started off, it was so quiet you could barely hear her whisper, and by the end of it, it was it was huge. And yeah, that's the emotion. Exactly. That's why you want it. I mean, you do need to manage it. You need to be able to control it, because what somebody does in a studio isn't necessarily going to translate when it's had a microphone put through it and it's coming out of speakers at the other end. I have a problem with the kind of the really purist classical music ethos of, well, we just put the mics up, record it, and that's it, because that's not necessarily going to work. Our ears and our brains are incredibly sophisticated, so when we're in a live situation listening to something, it's a totally different experience than when we're listening to recorded sound. So you definitely need to influence all of these factors. But yeah, to just remove them and to squash it all out in such an unnatural way. The compressors that we've been using since the 60s and 70s, they're great. They're musical, right? They were designed. One of the things about the whole digital versus analog kind of debate is when the first digital processors came out, they just had a bunch of numbers in boxes, and you could do pretty much anything you liked with them, but it might or might not sound good. Whereas an old analog unit, you maybe have 4 or 5 knobs. The EQs might be switchable EQs where you only have 3 or 4 bands that you can choose. Maybe you've only got a certain number of ratios on the compressor. Maybe you've only got a certain number of attack times. Those values on that box were chosen because they sound musical, because they're musically useful. They generate something that's pleasing to listen to. And so yeah, that's what this is all about, is getting the emotion and the feel of the music through to the listener. And yeah, if you take too much out of the dynamics, you've cut that option out.
There's so much that I stopped hearing or stopped feeling. I'll give you an example. Once I opened my brain up to it, today we had a vocal and I had smoothed it out with a low ratio compression, dug into the vocal deep and made the release as slow as possible. And the vocal just sat nicely. Then eventually I took the release and made it as fast as it could be, and all of a sudden I could feel excitement. And what I related it to was, you'll hear in songs where they have the swish go up, that volume like shh, and it's an exciting like rise up. That's what it felt like the vocal was doing. Like I could feel the vocal coming up instead of sitting still. And in effect, I'm listening to mixes now for emotion. How can I do stuff to emotionally move people? And I could feel the vocal affecting me emotionally. So there was that. It allowed it to swish up. And then another thing I noticed was when I mix, once my ears are acclimated to a certain level, like if this is the max you can go, I don't have to always go to the max to give you a feeling of increase. So I could jump from here to here, and then come down a little and jump from there. And by the time at the end of the song, I'm up here. So those different volume jumps, getting higher and higher each time, that dynamic was, I was like, wow, I have extra tools now that I can use in the mix because I'm actually taking a look at this stuff. And I am one I'm in love with loud, hard-hitting, but once, like I said, once I realized that a tool for emotion was taken away, which meant I'm left handicapped, my whole thinking changed. I went down the rabbit hole. Well, I'm down in the rabbit hole now with this stuff. But these are some of the things that I'm catching.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it'll be interesting to see where you end up. Something that hearing you talk there reminded me of was way back when I first started working at the studio. I mean, I was lucky that I was trained up as a mastering engineer, but the room that I worked with had a live room, so it had the managing director Steinway in there. And I mean, I think he made the recording studio, so he had somewhere for his piano. But so I got to do some kind of small scale recording, kind of jazz groups and smaller classical ensembles and stuff, which was fantastic for me. But initially I had one of the first ever 20-bit digital desks, the Yamaha DMC 1000. It's the kind of the predecessor to the O2R and the O2R 96 and all of those Yamaha digital desks. It didn't have, you didn't have plugins, it didn't have all of that built-in processing that you have, and I didn't have huge racks of outboard to begin with. We started getting stuff in later as we did more and more, but initially it was kind of very purist digital studio. And so some of the first mixes I did were almost entirely without compression, and that meant an enormous number of fader rides. I mean, I had automation on this desk, and you know, it really was, it was the exact opposite of kind of all faders up and just leave it flat. Everything was riding in and out. Then when I later on was working with more compression, what I noticed is as soon as you put a compressor on one thing to make it more consistent, suddenly everything else starts sounding inconsistent next to it. So you compress a vocal and suddenly you want to compress the bass, and you compress the bass and suddenly you want to compress the guitars, and you compress, and it spreads throughout. Now I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because lots of genres need that, and like you say, it gives you extra tools that you can use. But it's fascinating to do the opposite and say, okay, I'm just going to do something with no compression at all and do it all with fader rides, and it's so much more work, but the result is fantastic. Those early recordings and mixes I did are still some of my favorite things that I ever did, and they're really light on uses of compression. And one other thing that occurred to me just while I was talking there is, of course, something that loads of, you know, the great engineers that who did all those recordings that we love from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of them would do fader rides, but they would do them into compression. Lots of DAWs that we have, you have inserts where you put your plugins, and they are pre-fader. So the signal gets compressed, and then you pull the fader up or down, and you're pulling up and down the compressed signal. When I'm mastering, and actually when I mix, a lot of the time I like to have the fader pre-compression, so that I can choose to push it up harder and get more compression at a certain point, and then pull it back, and actually there'll be no compression at some point, and you'll just get the raw. So I mean, that's another tool that you might want to experiment with if you haven't already. You know, it's like everything. There are so many ways to use these tools, so many results that you can get, which is what makes it interesting. I've got a question here from Diego. What do you think of parallel compression? I personally go for multiband MS compression. How about using FreeG to use RMS as a reference in the mix and master? I haven't come across FreeG. I could quickly Google it and see what I get. British Gymnastics. Okay, Synaxis, that'll be it. So it's giving you, it's got a master fader. It's giving you, if it reads out RMS, you can use it. There are so many loudness meters around nowadays. I think it's valuable. I think that another thing that I didn't say as part of the demonstration is that the loudness meters that are like the LCast that I was talking about and the ones made by TC Electronic and NewGen, these are going to be used in broadcast to measure our audio. I wrote a piece about this for Audio Media Magazine recently. Even though the broadcast standards don't apply to us, who cares whether the standard's 23 for us, minus 23? We don't, you know, it doesn't bother us. But what we need to know is that somebody further down the chain, the broadcast chain, or maybe on YouTube or wherever, is going to measure our music using these loudness meters and make decisions about how loud it should be played back. So I think these days, if you're already used to using a VU meter or an RMS meter or a TT meter, by all means go ahead with that. But I think if you're new to this idea and you're kind of experimenting with metering, I would encourage you to start using the loudness meters, because that's the way that it's going to go. That's the future. So understanding how those meters react to what you give them is going to be really important. So I mean, maybe FreeG has an R128 EBU loudness possibility, you know, that in which case it could be a good option. Parallel compression, I actually think parallel compression is currently one of the most overused things there is. It's great if you want to get some of that compressed sound into a signal without removing all of the light and shade. Fantastic. If you overuse it, for me, it tends to make things sound like mush. You just kind of get all this low-level crap floating around at the bottom end of your mix not really doing anything useful. By all means, use parallel compression, but use it with intent. You know, think to yourself, okay, that needs parallel compression. I'm going to try some on there, rather than, you know, I've heard some really big name engineers saying they put it on everything. I mean, if it works for you, great. But I like top-down compression, just tasteful, used in moderation compression. It's very rare that I use MS compression, especially in mastering. It can be useful in classical, where you don't want that, you know, that kind of pushing down on the loud sections feels quite unnatural. But if you need kind of more to fill out the texture and get more kind of solidity and warmth into the signal without adding extra compression, parallel compression can be a good option. But please, moderation. You know, it's parallel compression and saturation. Everybody thinks they're the secret to analog warmth. They're not the secret to analog warmth. The secret to analog warmth is balanced EQ. Loads of that analog stuff from back in the day just sounds a bit dull, and actually we quite like that. You know, so experiment with that first. MS processing, I have never used MS compression on a master. I'm just thinking whether that's literally true. I may have used it once. MSEQ I use sometimes and can be very useful. The last album I did for Joe, one of the songs, he had these huge toms, sounded fantastic, but they were just booming out a little bit too much at kind of 100 hertz. But in the center, and they were at the edges of the image, at the center of the image, he had this nice big bass. And if I tried notching out the EQ to tame the boom in those toms over the whole stereo image, it just sucked the life out of the bass sound. So I just used a bit of side EQ to pull the ring out of those toms a little bit, just to get it under control. They were still nice and big, but they just control them a little bit without affecting the bass in the center. So that kind of control can be very powerful in mastering. You have to be careful because it will mess with the stereo image. If you think of a guitar panned at 2 o'clock, if you use EQ that affects the low end of that guitar and you take some out of the side channels, it kind of will pull the low end of the guitar towards the middle of the image, but it'll leave the top end out there. So your guitar that used to be here, it's kind of stretched across the stereo image. So again, like all of these things, you have to use it. It's a very powerful tool. You have to use it with care. Compression on a stereo mix, unless it's an effect, you know, kind of some kind of wacky, interesting effect, I wouldn't go there. Because then you get that stretching effect, but it's kind of a stretching effect that reacts to the music. So when something is loud, it might be more stretched than when it's less stretched. You know, that starts to kind of do really quite weird things, I think, to the musical signal. So I'm not a big fan of that. I do use multiband compression when I'm mastering quite a bit. I tend to use it very sparingly. I only use 3 bands usually, and I'm using it in a way that sounds as much like a broadband compressor as I can. You know, rather than kind of 5 bands and all this wild stuff. But it can be a very valuable way of just allowing you to be invisible. You can lift the level or pull the mix together nicely without causing obvious pumping. So I do find it valuable in that sense. Do we have any more questions?
I'm looking at someone is speaking about multiple drum hits, the rapid fire drum hits, and what this stuff will do to that, like what YouTube will do to that.
I don't know for certain. I mean, one thing we don't know about YouTube is how are they measuring the loudness. I don't think they're using R128. I don't think they're using LUFS because the replay volume is not consistent enough. Although that could be to do with the limitations of how they've implemented it. If the volume control is being applied in the browser, they may not have really fine control. You know, it may be kind of, it has to be there or it has to be there. And if the ideal place is in between, then you won't get the perfect value. But most methods of measuring loudness basically use a kind of an RMS based approach. And one of the things about RMS is it reacts less quickly to stuff like peak information. If you watch an RMS meter and a peak meter, the peak meter might go whoom like this, and the RMS meter will just go like that. So certainly my experience with R128 is that it's pretty good. The results that I get in terms of me judging loudness by my ears and then using the meters to set the loudness, I find there's quite a good agreement there. So I think it's quite a good system for judging loudness. It works pretty well. I wouldn't. There's definitely going to be stuff that's going to catch these systems out, right? They're computer algorithms. There's going to be a limit to what they can do. They won't always agree with what our ears tell us. But on the whole, they're pretty successful. So I wouldn't imagine, even VU meters work perfectly well for judging loudness on kind of straight ahead rock with a kind of doom cha, and like death metal where it's kind of all that stuff. So yeah, I would expect them to work pretty well. Got a question here. Artists' headphones and the color they can put on the signal and how they affect mastering and trying to bring the original intent to the listener. I'm not sure whether that means the performers when they're originally recording the songs, or people who are having their material mastered and then going away and listening on headphones.
But the question is more about, that all these new headphones and made by musician and other artists that they bring color, so they actually add something to the mix. How can you make a master so that you make sure that the original shape of the track comes across and it's not transformed by the headphones?
Okay, so they're talking about stuff like Beats. I went and tried some Beats in the Apple Store recently, and I was gobsmacked, to use a UK expression. They just had this huge lump down at kind of 100, 150 hertz or something. They just added a load of not really deep bass, not particularly. They would just make everything sound dull and muffled. So the only way to make it, by the time I turned it up so that it felt loud enough, my ears started to hurt. The opposite extreme would be something like a mobile phone speaker where there's no bass at all and it's just this horrible kind of little tinny or earbuds. It's one of the things about mastering. Mastering monitoring should be as uncolored as possible. Lots of people hear mastering speakers and think they kind of sound bland or uninteresting. Studio monitors are often kind of made to get a great vibe in the room and get everybody excited and sound really exciting when they're loud. That's not what you want in a mastering system. The mastering system is intended to be as neutral as possible. So then if somebody plays it back on a boombox with or a pair of Beats headphones with really wild bass, or if they play it back on a mobile phone speaker, that's how they listen to all their music in that situation. So if you have a pair of Beats headphones, you're used to hearing everything with loads of bass. If you have a mobile phone with no bass at all, you're used to hearing everything sounding really tinny and with no bass at all. What you want is to get the perfect balance going into those systems so that what comes out is what the listener expects, and it will then sound, because at least back in the day, everything was mastered by mastering engineers whose systems were reasonably consistent from one to another, and they would all, we all listen to other people's work to make sure that we're in the right ballpark. You would end up with this consistency, and then you would get consistency out in the real world. So my personal response to something like Beats is to ignore it. If somebody chooses to listen to their music effectively with a low frequency EQ on it all the time, that's fine. If that's what they like, why not? But I'm not going to master my music with less bass to compensate for the people who listen on Beats, because it'll make it sound wrong to everybody else in the world, and even worse to somebody listening on earbuds like this or a mobile phone speaker. That's the whole issue of translation in mastering, is finding that kind of perfect middle line where it's going to work in the widest possible range of environments. And that's another reason why dynamic control is important in mastering, because without that dynamic control on a tiny little speaker, maybe the quiet bits will be completely inaudible or the loud bits will be distort. It's again all just about finding that perfect balance point. I just want to quickly mention, if anybody is watching this and is interested in the kind of stuff that we're talking about and getting more information and hearing concrete examples and stuff, you might want to check out the webpage with all of those resources that I showed you on my site earlier. But I do a thing called the Home Mastering Masterclass, which is an 8-week course where every week I master a different song, and there are videos that show how I master those songs and the techniques I use, what I use, why I do it, and I go into all of this kind of stuff that we're talking in loads of detail. And that's going to be running again from the middle of April. So if you go to homemastering.com, there's a box there. You can just drop your email in, and then you'll get notified as soon as that sign-ups for that are open. You might want to check that out in order to, if you want to take this stuff to the next level for you. I've had hundreds of people take the course now, and really great feedback. People really enjoy it. So that's another option. I've got some more questions here. Diego uses the B&W P5 headphones. I haven't tried those. I have Sennheiser HD650s. They're something of an industry standard. I know them inside out. I love them. One good thing, if you've seen pictures of my studio, you'll see I've got this little TC Electronic Firewire audio interface that I use here in my home studio. The nice thing about that, in combination with the HD650s, is I can just put those in a shoulder bag, take them anywhere, go into somebody else's studio, plug them in, and I know exactly what I'm hearing and can compare what I hear on the headphones with what I hear from the speakers. It gives me a really good way to shift from one monitoring environment to another. It's not really a mastering tip, it's just a random tip for you. Okay, I think we're probably getting to the point. It's 10 past midnight here. My voice is getting a bit tired. Unless anybody has a really urgent question, I think we might wrap it up. Feel free to follow me on Twitter @IanShepherd, or facebook.com/shepherd.ian, I think, is where I am on Facebook. I try to answer questions. I get so many questions these days, I can't always answer them all. But I love to hear from people, and what you're finding a challenge, what you're struggling with, so that maybe I can try and help with YouTube videos or blog posts or whatever in the future. It'd be great to make some more connections with you. Thank you very much to everybody. Thanks to my guests, Diego Siegador and Maat, for helping me with the Hangout and relaying those questions to me. I hope you enjoyed the webcast. I hope you enjoyed Dynamic Range Day. I think officially it's over now because I'm going to bed. But if you guys want to keep going, please carry on sharing. I know further around the world it's not nearly as late. Keep spreading the word, keep talking to people, and getting the word out. Thanks very much, and I will see you online sometime soon.